She thought blocking my driveway was a daily inconvenience. She didn't realize it was becoming a blueprint for her worst mistake, and the first thing I heard that morning wasn't my alarm. It was the low grind of rubber against concrete echoing through the quiet cul-de-sac, like something breaking under pressure. I stepped outside barefoot, the cool stone biting into my heels, and there it was again. Linda Whitmore's white SUV parked sideways across my driveway, like she owned the air I breathed. The engine idling, exhaust drifting in thin gray ribbons that smelled like burn impatience. She wasn't even in the car this time. Just left it there like a message, like she had every other morning for the past 3 weeks. Always around 6:10 a.m. Always just long enough to make me late. Just long enough to remind me who she thought was in charge. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm a contractor. I build things for a living, straight lines, measured edges, everything where it belongs. That's why I bought this place. Long, narrow driveway. Just enough clearance for one vehicle. No HOA access. No shared easement. Private property down to the inch. At least that's what the deed says. But Linda, she had her own version of reality. HOA president for 5 years. Tennis outfits pressed sharper than her tone. Voice sweet enough to pass for polite until you listened closely and heard the steel underneath. She called it temporary community access. Said the street design required flexibility. Said my driveway was underutilized space. Like it was some public resource she could tap whenever it suited her. The first time I confronted her, she smiled like I'd just asked a stupid question. It's only for a few minutes, Ethan, she said, keys dangling from her fingers. You wouldn't want to disrupt neighborhood flow, would you? Neighborhood flow, like my schedule, my job, my time didn't count. Like the crunch of gravel under my truck tires every morning was just background noise in her little kingdom. The second week, it got worse, longer stops. Sometimes she'd just leave the car and walk off, clipboard in hand, inspecting lawns like she was auditing reality itself. One morning I missed a client meeting because I couldn't get out. Stood there watching the clock tick while her SUV sat there silent and immovable, sun climbing higher, heat rising off the hood. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, not exactly. More like alignment, like a measurement snapping into place. I stopped knocking on her door, stopped arguing, stopped reacting. Instead, I started observing the angle of her parking, the width between the curb and my property line, the exact turn radius of her SUV. I measured everything. Tapes stretched across gravel, chalk marks on concrete. The numbers told a story she didn't know she was part of, and every morning after that, when I heard the soft crunch of her tires pulling in, I didn't step outside anymore. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching, calculating, because Linda thought she was blocking my driveway. But what she didn't understand was she was teaching me exactly how to trap her in it. By the third week, I could tell what kind of morning it was going to be just from the way her engine idled. A low, uneven hum that carried through the still air before the sun even hit the rooftops. And every time that sound rolled into my driveway, it felt less like a coincidence and more like a routine she had perfected. I started noticing the details most people would ignore. The exact angle of her front tire cutting across the edge of my concrete. The way her rear bumper hovered just inches over the property line, like she knew exactly how far she could push it without technically crossing into something enforceable. And that was the thing about Linda. She lived in that gray space between what was allowed and what she could get away with. One morning I stepped outside earlier than usual, the air still cool, carrying that faint smell of wet grass and distant coffee. And there she was again, sitting in the driver's seat this time, sunglasses on even though the sky was barely awake, fingers tapping against the steering wheel like she was waiting for something. I walked up slow, gravel crunching under my boots, and knocked lightly on her window. She rolled it down just enough for her voice to slip through. You are blocking my driveway again, I said, calm, measured, the same tone I use when explaining a blueprint to a client. She smiled without looking at me, eyes still forward. I will only be a minute. Ethan, community inspection, she said, like that explained everything. Like that gave her permission. I glanced down at the clipboard on her lap. Blank pages, no notes, just a prop to justify the position she had parked herself into. There is no inspection happening on my driveway, I replied, and that is when she finally turned her head, slow, deliberate, that smile tightening just a little at the corners. You really should learn how this neighborhood works, she said, voice softer now. but sharper. Some spaces are more flexible than others. Flexible. That word stuck with me longer than it should have. I watched her drive off 10 minutes later, tires rolling over the same line she crossed every day, and instead of feeling frustrated, I felt something else settle in, clarity, because flexibility cuts both ways. That afternoon, I pulled out the original survey from when I bought the house, spread it across my workbench, the paper worn at the edges but the lines still precise, every inch accounted for, every boundary locked in place long before Linda ever decided my driveway was part of her routine. I ran my finger along the measurements, matching them to the marks I had already made outside, and everything lined up exactly the way it should. No shared access, no easement, nothing that gave her the right to use that space without permission. I stepped back, looked at the driveway through the open garage, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the concrete. And for the first time, I saw it differently, not just as a place to park, but as a system, a narrow corridor with fixed limits, where entry and exit depended entirely on angles and space. And that was when the idea started forming, not fast, not all at once, but piece by piece, like building something from the ground up. I thought about weight, about immovable objects, about how little room there really was once something solid occupied the edges, and more importantly, I thought about habits, because Linda did not just park there randomly. She followed the same pattern every single day, same time, same angle, same assumption that nothing would ever change. I spent that evening walking the driveway again, measuring twice, then a third time just to be sure. Chalk lines marking positions where something permanent could stand without crossing any legal boundary, without giving her any argument to lean on. The air cooled as the sun dropped, carrying that faint metallic scent from my tools, and with every measurement, every mark, the plan became clearer, not aggressive, not reckless, just precise, because this was never about stopping her from parking there, not directly. It was about letting her do exactly what she always did, and making sure that this time, when she tried to leave, the rules she had been bending would finally hold her in place. The next morning started earlier than usual, long before the sky even hinted at light, and the cold air had that sharp edge that wakes you up faster than coffee ever could. I stood at the edge of my driveway with a flashlight cutting through the dark, watching the crane operator ease the first concrete planter into position, the low hydraulic hum vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. Each planter was solid poured concrete, for tons of weight shaped into something that looked decorative enough to pass as landscaping, but heavy enough that once it touched down, it was not going anywhere. I had spent 2 days sourcing them from a commercial supplier across town, the kind of place that usually outfits city plazas and government buildings, not suburban driveways. But money and measurements tend to make things happen, and I had both. The first planter settled exactly on the chalk line I had marked the night before, the soft thud of concrete meeting ground sending a faint tremor through the narrow strip of gravel beside it. I stepped forward, checking the distance with my tape measure, 18 inches from the property edge. Perfectly within my boundary, perfectly legal. The operator glanced down at me for confirmation, and I gave a small nod. No words needed. This was just another job to him. But to me it felt like setting the first piece of something much bigger. The second planter came next, placed opposite the first, creating a narrowing channel that still allowed a vehicle to enter, but only at a very specific angle. An angle I had watched Linda use every single morning without fail. The third and fourth planters completed the formation, not blocking anything outright, not violating any access code, just redefining the space in a way that turned flexibility into precision. By the time the crane packed up and the sky shifted from black to deep gray, everything was in place. The driveway looked different now, not dramatic, not obvious, just tighter, more intentional, like it had always been designed this way. I wiped my hands on a rag, the faint dust of concrete clinging to my skin, and stepped back, listening to the quiet settle in again. No engines, no footsteps, just the distant sound of a sprinkler system starting up somewhere down the street. Inside the house, the coffee maker clicked on, filling the air with that familiar bitter warmth, and I stood by the window, mug in hand, waiting, not impatient, not nervous, just ready. At exactly 6:11 a.m., I heard it, the low rumble of Linda's SUV turning onto the street. The sound carried differently now, sharper somehow, like the space itself was reacting. I watched her headlights sweep across the driveway, slow, confident, exactly the way they always did. She did not hesitate, did not pause to reconsider, because why would she? Nothing had ever stopped her before. The front tires rolled in, adjusting slightly to clear the first planter, just like I knew they would. She corrected the steering wheel, easing forward into the narrowed path, the rear end sliding just a bit closer to the opposite side. Inches that mattered now in a way they never had before. I could almost map her movements without looking. Every turn predictable, every adjustment part of the same routine she had built for herself. The engine idled for a moment once she settled into position, and then it shut off, silence dropping over the driveway like a held breath. She stepped out, door closing with that familiar soft thud, keys in hand, posture relaxed, completely unaware of what had changed. I took a slow sip of coffee, the heat cutting through the cool air as I watched her walk away, clipboard under her arm, already focused on whatever imaginary inspection she had planned for the morning. And for a moment, everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The same driveway, the same car, the same routine, but the difference was in the details, in the inches she had already used up without realizing it, in the space that no longer existed behind her. And as the sun finally broke over the rooftops, casting long shadows from those concrete planters across the ground, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Getting in had never been the problem. It was what came next that was going to change everything. The first sign something was wrong came 23 minutes later. Not a crash, not a shout. Just the sharp click of a car door opening again, followed by a pause that stretched longer than it should have. I was already at the window, coffee gone cold in my hand, watching as Linda stepped back into view, her heels tapping lightly against the concrete, slower this time, her head tilting slightly as she looked at the driveway like it had changed while she was gone, which in a way, it had. She walked around the front of her SUV, eyes tracing the edges of the planters, that faint crease forming between her eyebrows. Not panic, not yet, just confusion, the kind that comes when reality does not match expectation. She reached for her door, slid back into the driver's seat, and a second later the engine turned over, a low steady rumble filling the narrow space. I could almost feel the vibration through the glass. She shifted into reverse, the brake lights flaring red against the pale morning light. And then she stopped, just for a second, because the angle was tighter now, the space behind her no longer forgiving. She adjusted the wheel, easing back slowly, tires rolling inches at a time, the soft crunch of gravel mixing with the faint scrape of rubber against concrete, subtle, but enough to make her pause again. I saw her hands tighten on the steering wheel, shoulders stiffening just a fraction. She pulled forward, tried again, this time turning sharper. But the planters did exactly what they were meant to do. They did not block her. They guided her, limited her, forced every movement into a narrower path than she was used to. The engine revved slightly, not aggressive, just uncertain, like she was trying to feel her way out of a space that no longer behaved the way she expected. I stepped outside then, the cool air carrying the faint smell of exhaust and fresh concrete, the sound of her engine echoing between the planters, amplifying every adjustment she made. She noticed me immediately. Of course she did. Her window slid down halfway, that same controlled expression on her face, but now there was something else underneath it, something tighter. "Ethan, what is this?" she asked, her voice still measured but no longer casual. I glanced at the planters, then back at her. "Landscaping," I said simply, keeping my tone neutral, the same way I had every other morning. She looked past me, scanning the placement, the spacing, calculating in her own way now, but she was late to the math. "You cannot just put obstacles in a shared access point," she said, the words coming faster now, more certain than she felt. I shook my head slightly. "This is not a shared access point," I replied, and I could see it then, the moment that landed. Not fully, not completely, but enough to disrupt the narrative she had been repeating to herself for weeks. She shifted back into reverse again, slower this time, more careful, trying to find an angle that did not exist anymore. The tires edged back, then stopped, forward again, then back, each movement smaller than the last, the space closing in not physically, but logically, because every option she tried had already been accounted for before she ever pulled in. The engine sound changed, that steady confidence replaced by a higher strained note, not from force, but from repetition, from trying the same motion with slightly different angles, expecting a different result. I leaned against the edge of the garage, arms crossed loosely, not blocking, not interfering, just watching, because this was the part that mattered, not the planters themselves, not the measurements, but the realization building in her mind, piece by piece, that the routine she relied on had just become a constraint she could not ignore. She stopped again, this time longer, the engine idling as she looked straight ahead, hands still on the wheel, and for a moment, everything went quiet except for that low mechanical hum and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. She opened the door and stepped out once more, slower now, walking around the vehicle with deliberate steps, eyes tracing the exact same lines I had measured days before, except now she was seeing them from the inside of the problem instead of the outside. She turned toward me, that practiced composure still in place but cracking at the edges. "Move them," she said, not asking, not yet, just stating it like it was still an option, and I could not help the slight shift in my expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, just recognition. Because for the first time since this started, Linda was not controlling the situation, she was reacting to it, and the driveway that had always been flexible in her mind had finally become exactly what it was on paper, fixed, defined, and completely out of her control for a second. The only thing I heard was the soft ticking of her engine cooling and the faint rustle of leaves somewhere down the block, and then she said it again, sharper this time, "Move them," like repeating it would turn it into an order instead of a request. I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against the garage frame, the wood warm now from the rising sun, and shook my head once, slow and simple. "They are on my property," I said, the words landing flat and clean between us, no emotion, no edge, just fact. Her jaw tightened, not dramatically, just enough to show the shift. "You are obstructing access," she replied quickly, the confidence in her voice trying to outrun the situation she was standing in. I let out a quiet breath, the smell of exhaust still lingering in the air. "There is no shared access here," I said, and I could see her replaying that sentence in her head, testing it against whatever version of the rules she had been operating under. She glanced back at the SUV, then at the planters again, eyes moving faster now, scanning for something she could use, something she could point to and claim as a violation. But there was nothing, just concrete, gravel, and lines that had been there long before either of us moved in. She turned back to the car and slid into the driver's seat again, door closing with a firmer sound this time. The engine started up once more, louder now in the tighter space. She tried reversing again, slower, more deliberate, turning the wheel inch by inch, the tires rolling back until they met the invisible limit I had built into that space. She stopped, pulled forward, adjusted, tried again, each movement smaller, more controlled, but also more constrained. The pattern was the same, just compressed, like watching someone try to solve a puzzle with pieces that no longer fit the way they used to. The engine note shifted higher as she pressed the gas slightly harder. Not aggressive, just searching, and the sound bounced between the planters in a way that made the space feel even narrower. She stopped again, this time longer, the brake lights glowing steady red. I could see her shoulders rise and fall once, a measured breath. Then she cut the engine completely, silence dropping in hard after the constant hum. She stepped out again, quicker now, heels striking the concrete with a sharper rhythm, and walked straight toward me, the clipboard gone, her hands free, posture straighter. "This is harassment," she said, voice firm, controlled, the kind of tone that usually made people back off. I did not move, did not change my stance. "No," I replied, just as steady. "This is my driveway." And for a moment, we just stood there, the space between us filled with everything that had been building for weeks. She looked past me again, scanning the edges, the corners, like she might find some hidden gap she could exploit, but there was nothing new to discover, only what had always been there, now arranged in a way she could not ignore. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes, she said, and there it was, not authority, not control, just pressure, time pressing in the same way the space around her car was. I nodded slightly. "Then you might want to leave," I said, calm as ever, and that was when it really settled in for her. Not all at once, not like a switch flipping, but like a weight lowering slowly into place. She turned back toward the SUV, walked around it one more time, slower now, eyes tracing the exact path she would need to take, except that path required space she no longer had. She opened the driver door again, paused, then closed it without getting in, pulling out her phone instead, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I could not hear what she was saying when she lifted it to her ear, but I did not need to. The tone, the pace, the way she turned slightly away from me as she spoke, it all said the same thing. She was calling for help, and I leaned back against the garage again, folding my arms loosely, not tense, not triumphant, just waiting, because this part had always been inevitable. The moment where her routine met reality, and she had to bring someone else in to try to fix it. And as the sun climbed higher, casting sharper shadows from those concrete planters across the driveway, I knew that whoever showed up next was not going to change the measurements, the lines, or the simple fact that she had driven into a space that was never hers to use. And now, for the first time, she had to deal with it on my terms. The call did not take long, maybe 5 minutes, but in that time the entire street seemed to wake up, curtains shifting, front doors opening just a few inches. The quiet curiosity of neighbors drawn in by the unfamiliar rhythm of an engine that kept starting and stopping without ever leaving. I stayed where I was, leaning against the garage, watching as Linda paced beside her SUV, phone pressed tight against her ear, her voice low but sharp, the kind of tone that was not asking for help but demanding it. Every few seconds, she glanced back at the planters like they might move if she stared hard enough, like the problem might solve itself if she refused to accept it. But concrete does not negotiate, and neither do property lines. When the black HOA sedan finally rolled up 10 minutes later, its tires crunching slowly over the curb edge, I could see the shift in her posture immediately, shoulders straightening, chin lifting, the authority she had lost for a moment snapping back into place. The car door opened, and out stepped Mark Ellison, vice president of the HOA, mid-50s, pressed shirt, neutral expression, the kind of man who preferred paperwork over confrontation. He looked from Linda to the SUV, then to the planters, taking in the scene with a slow, deliberate scan. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. Voice calm, measured, Linda stepped toward him quickly, gesturing back at the driveway. "He installed these barriers overnight, completely blocking access," she said, the words coming fast now. Confident again, like having an audience, restored her narrative. Mark nodded slightly, then turned his attention to me. "Sir, can you explain what is going on here?" he asked, and I pushed off the garage frame, walking forward a few steps, the gravel shifting under my boots. "It is my driveway," I said, simply, "and those are on my property." I could see him process that, eyes flicking down to the base of the planters, then back toward the edges of the concrete, measuring in his own way. "Linda says this is a shared access point," he replied, careful with his wording, not committing, just presenting the claim. I shook my head once. "There is no shared access easement on this lot," I said, keeping my tone even, and then I turned slightly, gesturing toward the garage where the survey documents sat on the workbench. "I can show you the property survey if you would like." There was a pause then, small but noticeable, the kind that stretches just enough for doubt to slip in. Mark glanced back at Linda, who was already shaking her head slightly. "We do not need paperwork. This is obvious," she said, but her voice had lost a fraction of its certainty. He did not respond to her right away. Instead, he stepped closer to the driveway, walking along the edge, looking at the spacing, the alignment, the way the planters sat perfectly within the boundary. He crouched slightly near one of them, running his hand along the base where it met the concrete, then stood back up. "These appear to be within the property line," he said slowly, more to himself than to either of us. Linda's expression tightened again. "That does not matter if they are obstructing community flow," she replied quickly, but the words felt thinner now, stretched over a foundation that was starting to crack. Mark exhaled quietly, looking back at her. "Community flow does not override private property without a recorded easement," he said, and there it was. The shift, subtle but real, the conversation moving away from assumption and into fact. Linda turned toward him, disbelief flickering across her face. "So you are saying he can just trap my car here?" she asked, and Mark hesitated for a second, choosing his words carefully. "I am saying he has not violated any HOA rule or municipal code based on what I can see," he replied, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Linda looked back at the SUV, then at the narrow space around it, the reality of the situation settling. In layer by layer, not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable. The driveway had not changed its ownership, only its shape, and she had driven into it under the same assumption she had been using for weeks, except now that assumption had nowhere left to go. Mark stepped back slightly, folding his arms. "You may need to contact a towing service with specialized equipment," he added, almost as an afterthought. And Linda let out a short breath, not quite a sigh, not quite frustration, just the sound of someone realizing that control had slipped out of reach. I stayed quiet, watching it all unfold, because this was never about forcing her into a mistake. It was about letting her repeat the same one until the situation itself corrected her. And as the morning sun climbed higher, casting sharper light across the concrete and the immovable edges I had set in place, it became clear to everyone standing there that nothing about this was temporary anymore. The tow truck showed up just after 8, the low diesel rumble announcing it before it even turned onto the street. And by then half the neighborhood was already watching, subtle at first, people pretending to check their mail or water their lawns. But the longer Linda's SUV sat there unmoving, the less subtle it became. The driver stepped out slow, a tall guy in a faded work shirt, eyes scanning the situation with the kind of quiet assessment that comes from years of dealing with problems people think can be solved quickly. He walked the length of the driveway once, boots crunching lightly against the gravel edge, then circled back toward the front of the SUV, looking at the spacing between the planters, the angle of the vehicle, the limited room behind it. "That is tight," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Linda stepped forward immediately, her tone sharp but controlled. "Just hook it up and pull it out," she said. Like this was a routine job. Like the solution was obvious. The driver shook his head slowly, not dismissive, just factual. "It does not work like that," he replied, glancing at the planters again. "I need clearance to maneuver, and you do not have it." She frowned, the lines around her eyes tightening as she processed that. "So move those," she said, pointing toward the concrete, her voice carrying a little further now, enough for the nearby neighbors to hear. I stayed where I was, arms relaxed at my sides. "They are not going anywhere," I said, calm, steady, and the driver looked between us, reading the situation in a way that had nothing to do with words. He stepped back, pulling a tape measure from his pocket, extending it from the rear of the SUV to the nearest planter, then checking the side clearance, his movements precise, methodical, like he was mapping out a problem that already had a clear answer. "I can try with a smaller rig," he said finally. "But even then, you are looking at a risk of damage just from the angles alone." Linda's expression shifted again, not anger, not yet, just the first hint of something heavier, realization starting to settle in deeper. "There will be no damage," she said quickly, almost automatically, like saying it would make it true. The driver gave a small shrug. "Physics does not really take requests," he replied, and there was a quiet ripple of reaction from the small audience forming along the street. Nothing loud, just the kind of low murmur that comes when people recognize a situation turning. Linda turned back toward me then, her composure still there but thinner now, stretched across too many cracks. "This is intentional," she said, voice lower, more focused. "You set this up." I met her gaze without shifting. "I set my property," I replied, and that distinction hung in the air between us, simple but immovable. She looked back at the SUV again, then at the narrow path it had taken to get in, retracing the movement in her mind, except now she was doing it from the outside, seeing the same constraints I had calculated days before, the same limits she had driven past without noticing. The driver stepped back toward his truck, pulling out his phone, likely calling in for advice or additional equipment, but his tone carried enough for everyone to hear. "We might need a crane or specialized lift," he said, and that word, crane, landed differently, heavier, because it turned the situation from inconvenient into something much bigger, something that required planning, time, expense. Linda's shoulders dropped just slightly, the first visible sign that the situation had moved beyond her control. She stepped away from the SUV, pacing once along the edge of the driveway, heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that no longer felt confident, just restless, and I watched it all from where I stood. The morning sun now high enough to cast clear, sharp lines across everything. The planters, the vehicle, The exact boundaries that had always been there, but never enforced. And in that moment, with the tow truck idling uselessly at the curb and the quiet attention of the neighborhood fixed on the scene, it became clear that this was not just about getting a car out of a driveway anymore. It was about the cost of a habit that had gone unchecked for too long. And for the first time since this started, Linda was not the one setting the terms. She was the one trying to figure out how to get out of. Then by the time the second truck was mentioned over the driver's radio, the street had fully shifted from quiet curiosity to something closer to a live audience, the kind that pretends not to watch while tracking every detail, every movement, every word, and Linda could feel it. I could see it in the way her posture kept adjusting, shoulders pulling back, chin lifting, then dropping again when she realized there was no quick resolution waiting for her. The driver paced once more along the narrow space, running through options that all ended the same way: limited clearance, limited angles, too much weight, too little room, best case. We wait for specialized equipment, he said, voice steady, practical. But that phrase, wait, hung in the air heavier than anything else, because waiting meant time, and time meant attention, and attention was something Linda had always controlled until now. She turned toward Mark again, her voice lower, more urgent. You need to do something about this, she said, and for the first time, it sounded less like authority and more like pressure. Mark exhaled slowly, eyes moving between the planters, the SUV, and the clear edges of the property line that left him no room to reinterpret what he was seeing. There is nothing to enforce here, he replied, careful, measured, but firm, and that was when the shift became visible to everyone. Not just me, not just the driver, but the neighbors standing at a distance pretending to check their phones, because the structure Linda had relied on, the rules she bent and reshaped to suit her, were no longer bending. They were holding, and they were not holding for her. She turned away from him, pacing again, faster now, heels striking the concrete in sharp, uneven beats, the sound echoing between the planters like a reminder of how little space there really was. She stopped near the front of the SUV, running her hand lightly along the hood, not out of care, but out of habit, like grounding herself in something familiar. And then she looked at me again, longer this time, studying, recalculating. You could move them, she said, quieter now, almost conversational, like she was testing a different approach. I shook my head once, the same answer as before, unchanged. They are staying, I replied, and there was no edge in my voice, no satisfaction, just the same steady line I had been holding since the beginning. The driver cleared his throat slightly, drawing attention back to the practical side of the situation. Even with a smaller rig, you are looking at hours, maybe longer, he said, and the word hours seemed to land harder than Crane had earlier, because it stretched the moment out, turned it from a problem into a situation, something that could not be hidden or rushed or dismissed. Linda glanced down the street then, noticing what I had already seen. More doors open now, more faces visible, the quiet hum of conversation starting to build. Nothing direct, nothing confrontational, just the slow spread of awareness. And in that moment, the driveway stopped being just a piece of property and became something else entirely. A visible line between assumption and reality, between control and consequence. Mark shifted his weight slightly, looking at his watch, then back at Linda. You may want to consider alternative transportation, he said, the suggestion simple, almost neutral, but it carried the implication clearly. This was not getting resolved quickly, and she was not leaving in that SUV anytime soon. Linda let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when options narrow down to one or two and neither feels acceptable. She stepped away from the vehicle again, this time without pacing, just standing there, looking at the space that had closed in around her not physically, but logically, every inch accounted for, every angle fixed, and I stayed where I was, the morning sun, now fully up, casting sharp, defined shadows that mirrored the clarity of the situation itself. Because this had never been about forcing a reaction. It was about letting the reality of the space speak for itself. And now, with the tow truck idling, the HOA standing back, and the quiet weight of the neighborhood watching, that reality was impossible to ignore. The driveway had always belonged to me. But this was the first time it had ever been respected that way. By mid-morning, the sunlight had turned harsh and direct, flattening every shadow and making the entire scene feel exposed. like there was nowhere left for anything to hide. The second truck never came, not because it could not, but because the cost and complexity kept stacking higher with every phone call the driver made. Crane estimates, liability concerns, clearance limitations, each one another quiet confirmation that this was no longer a simple inconvenience. Linda stood near the curb now, phone in her hand, but no longer speaking, just scrolling, stopping, then scrolling again, like she was searching for something that would undo what had already been set in motion. Mark had stepped back entirely, arms folded, no longer involved. Beyond observation, the line had been drawn and he knew it. The driver finally shut off his engine, the sudden silence heavier than the constant idle that had filled the morning. "There is nothing more I can do right now," he said, voice neutral, not dismissive, just final. And that word settled everything. Linda looked at him, then at the SUV, then back at the planters, her expression no longer sharp or controlled, just still, like the energy she had been holding all morning had nowhere left to go. She took a slow breath, then another, and for a moment she did not say anything at all. The street was quiet too. Neighbors no longer pretending, just watching openly now, the kind of attention that does not need words to carry weight. I stepped forward slightly, not closing the distance, just shifting enough to be heard without raising my voice. "There is a rideshare pickup point at the end of the block," I said, calm, practical, the same tone I would use on any job site when a plan changed. She looked at me, really looked this time, not past me, not through me, but at me, and something in her expression finally aligned with the reality of the situation, not agreement, not acceptance, but recognition. She nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, then turned and walked toward the sidewalk, her steps slower now, measured, the sharp rhythm from earlier gone, replaced by something steadier, more controlled in a different way, not dominance, just adjustment. She paused once, near the end of the driveway, glancing back at the SUV, at the narrow space that had seemed so open just hours before, and then she kept walking, the sound of her steps fading as she moved down the block. The driver packed up his equipment, climbing back into the truck with a shrug that said he had seen situations like this before, just not quite like this. Mark lingered for another minute, then gave me a brief nod, not approval, not disapproval, just acknowledgement, before turning and heading back to his car. And just like that, the crowd began to dissolve, doors closing, curtains falling back into place, the quiet returning in layers until it felt like any other morning again, except it was not. Because the SUV was still there, still positioned exactly where it had been, but now it meant something different, not control, not convenience, just consequence. I walked back toward the garage, the concrete under my boots warm now, the faint smell of sun-heated gravel rising into the air, and set my empty coffee mug down on the workbench beside the folded survey papers. The lines on that paper had not changed, they never had, but for the first time since I moved in, they had been enforced. Without argument, without interpretation, just by existing. I glanced out once more at the driveway, at the planters casting long defined shadows across the narrow path, and at the SUV sitting perfectly still between them, and I could not help but notice how quiet everything felt now. No engine, no footsteps, no voices trying to reshape what was already clear, just space, defined exactly the way it was meant to be. And as I turned back toward the house, one thought settled in with a kind of final clarity. She had blocked my driveway every day thinking it was flexible, but today, she learned that some lines do not move, and once you cross them enough times, eventually, they hold you exactly where you stand.